Hello, friends, and welcome to the Black and Void from which I have been recording. Today I have a treat of a special story for you. It was written by my friend Zachary Bertha and first appeared in the Necro Omnomnomicon. Enjoy. The Madness of Mortimer Crove, a short story by Zachary Bertha, read by Dale Tormey. I made my way towards my final patient of the day. On days that we met, I always saved him for the end of my rounds. His wit and uncanny ability to remain coherent in this damnable place left me in a good mood to go home. Mortimer Crove was a man in his early 60s. He awaited me in a perpetually ill-lit room with dingy tiles that matched the gray of his remarkably full hair. It was in this room that I talked with Mortimer many days of his 2 years at Kings Park Asylum. I'd developed a respect for the man, even as I'd gained an understanding for the psychosis that had led him to slash his son's throat in the study of their home. The official diagnosis, the one that had been reached in the trial in which I had testified, was isolated stress-induced mania. The pressures of the good professor's job had mounted, and in an isolated episode he had disassociated with reality and experienced a violent outburst. While regrettable, it was not permanent, and I was confident he could be rehabilitated before 4 years had passed. As I arrived at his door, towards the middle of the hall in our low-security ward, I motioned for one of the orderlies, a man much larger than me, to join me outside of his room. A barely suppressed grunt came my way as he began lumbering in my direction. "I really don't understand why I gotta do this," the orderly sighed, clearly eager to go home for the night. "Doctor's pretty sure he ain't going nowhere." Yes, I brushed his complaints out of the air. "But procedure," I mumbled, trying to sound like I didn't look forward to my sessions with Dr. Crove. He shrugged, resentful but resigned, and opened the door. Nothing was new here. The cot was in a corner, the metal headboard against the far wall underneath a barred window, a chair adjacent. It was the same man who looked up and greeted me with the same smile he always had, sitting unrestrained in the same place in that cot. It was covered with white sheets, one of the few unstained sets left in the facility. They were cheap, not scratchy necessarily, but prone to tearing, so only the lightest of patients could hang themselves with one. The grout was black, far from the rainy day gray it once was. It had likely gone unclean since its installation decades ago. I looked up at the single bulb in the ceiling, covered first by glass, then by metal bars. It glowed the same yellow-orange that every other bulb in this wing of the asylum did, never failing to cast the most unflattering light on those unfortunate enough to be trapped underneath them. I could paint this scene from memory if I had to. I stepped inside and the door closed behind me. The single light in the room flickered for a moment, the soft popping nearly drowning out the sound of the door being locked from the outside. "Evening, Doctor," he said while I flopped into the chair, exhausted from the day. "Good evening, Dr. Crove," I replied. He had, after all, earned the title. "Dr. Waite, must we go over this again?" He smiled at me. "Call me Mortimer." This exchange was familiar to us, and we chuckled together. Then slowly let the silence reign. The light flickered, and I began our session. As was standard, I asked how he was feeling, what might have happened since last we had spoken, and if he had been taking his medication, as I had with all of my patients for the last 14 years of my practice. I studied him closely as he answered the questions, though only vaguely penned his responses into my sheet. He was tall, even sitting, and his features were softly hollowed by the overhead light. He had a short beard, just darker than his hair. He often twirled bits of that beard while he talked, a slight tick in an otherwise well-composed man. He spoke eloquently about himself, which was admirable, refreshing even. He was not a psychologist, but he was aware of his condition, and often came at it from an academic standpoint as much as he could. I had come to expect nothing less of him. "Well, Doctor," Mortimer said, pulling me back to the room. "I think that just about covers all the preliminaries, if I'm not mistaken." He was not. "What would you like to discuss today?" Patients often try and steer discussions like this, as a means of regaining control in their environment. Normally we didn't allow it, and it would have bothered me more except that Mortimer and I would accomplish the same conversation regardless. I flipped through his case file, though I needn't have. I knew much of it by heart by now, but the habits I'd made in university were not easily broken. It mentioned Dr. Crove's former position at Columbia, his research into Neolithic Mesopotamia, and the apparent toll it took on him. It mentioned a great deal about his son, who had been accepted to his father's prestigious university, only to leave after a year and a half to pursue artistic endeavors. This was a pursuit Mortimer had called both at the trial and to me among the worthiest of goals. His late wife had encouraged the Croves to become patrons of the arts. The file kept a timeline on his status as a patient and various requests. On my recommendation, they had ended his shock therapy, removed his restraints during non-contact hours, and along with moving him to a low-security ward, allowed him access to a radio twice a week. For reasons I did not understand, they denied my request to let him see his research notes. Twice. When I was assigned as his psychiatrist, I took it upon myself to gather his work from his vacant office at Columbia. Perhaps, I thought, there was something there that could help with his treatment. The case was well publicized, and the university was eager to wash their hands of anything to do with their former employee. However, the dusty notebooks had proved fruitless, and had sat in my office here for more than a year. After the second denial, he was heartbroken, and bored to tears in his little room. So I brought the man his notes anyway, and left them with him as long as he kept them hidden. I was in willful and flagrant disregard of the board's decision, but I knew this harmless old man far better than they did. His recollection brought me something that I hadn't explored yet. Tell me, Dr. Crove, what made you study ancient language?
I'm not sure about that, Doctor. A fascination with the ancient world, perhaps. Why did you study medicine?
I wanted to help people. I hoped that the flat half-truth would send the question back his way. He tilted his head slightly.
Come now, Doctor. We both know that's only half true. Nobody does what you do just to help people.
Without thinking, I raised an eyebrow and tilted my head to match his, before realizing the mistake of being so expressive with my patient and correcting it. I didn't respond to his prodding, and after a few moments he continued.
I am of the opinion that the ancients knew far more than we give them credit for, that among the knowledge lost to the ages are some amazing discoveries. I want to know what they knew.
An academic to the core, I thought. I see. How do you think that relates to your son's murder? I turned the page in the file describing the event in impeccable detail. The Crove's well-appointed study, a library more than anything else, was decorated in blood when the police arrived. The younger Crove's body sat in a marvelous oak chair, an antique freshly carved with foreign symbols on the backrest. His neck was agape and his clothes were stained a deep black cherry color. Mortimer was, by all accounts, tearing through books scattered across the rug, even as the police arrived to arrest him. He oscillated between mumbling and screaming, though what words he spoke, none could tell. The police had to forcibly restrain him, as he continued to try and redraw symbols from reference books with his son's fresh blood.
I don't understand. What would my studies have to do with that incident?
Mortimer grabbed the hairs on his chin as he spoke. He always referred to it as an incident rather than involve himself in the description of the event. He had maintained that the man who did that awful thing was not him. It had been his body for sure, but he neither wanted to or meant to do it. Well, there's the inscriptions surrounding his body. They were in Sumerian, if I recall. Mortimer's face looked uncomfortable, then ever so slightly sad before he let out a weighty sigh and looked at me concerned, but warm. He began muttering to himself. Dr. Crove, the Sumerian?
It was Akkadian, not Sumerian,
he snapped at me. I must have instantly looked confused and taken aback, as he took a deep breath and continued explaining.
It's a common mistake, really. They both have the same script, but Akkadian comes quite a bit later.
I nodded out of at least partially genuine interest. Mortimer continued.
The writing was part of a spell I was casting.
What? This was new and interesting, and I began scribbling in my notes. The pen nearly tore through the page with excitement. Never in his 2 years here had he mentioned this or mentioned anything like this. It was true pathology, and I was shaking to contain myself. Tell me more about this spell, Mortimer, I said, my voice tentative and nearly begging. I put my pen to the paper in anticipation, the ink bleeding through the page while I waited.
Certainly, Doctor. The spell is one of transference, taken from a collection of tablets found in the ruins of an Akkadian city. Had it worked, I would have entered the body of my son.
Entered his body? The rephrasing the last few words of a patient's explanation was a reflex more than anything else, and they spilled out without a thought of their oddity. The words he spoke weren't even that odd, at least compared to the gibberish I often got to decipher from other patients. It was the way in which he had said them that gave me pause. He was clinical, lecturing even, like he wanted me to understand his new material that we should have covered in the reading from the previous night.
Not physically, of course, Doctor. I'm not a Greek.
His chuckles went unmatched, the apparent attempt at crude humor lost on me.
My consciousness, or psyche, whatever the devil you professionals call it, would have swapped with my son's, such that my thoughts were inhabiting his body.
His confident tone would have been convincing were we not talking about nearly anything else. Mortimer watched me with careful intensity as I wrote, the confusion displayed prominently on my face. His hand almost took to be tracking mine as I wrote. The light flickered. Why? It was a poor question. I was allowing him to dive deeper into his psychosis, and it would make it harder to pull him out. But my scientific curiosity had been piqued, to the point where I no longer cared.
The mind as it ages is a terrible thing, Doctor. My cognition was slipping.
But you don't have dementia, I interrupted. You keep your mind active and—
Oh, don't tell me what I have, you psychiatric prick!
Mortimer's voice raised. He wasn't yelling, at least not enough to disturb the orderly, but louder than his usual susurrant tone. I pushed back in my chair, taken aback by his anger. He saw, it seemed, and he calmed down before continuing.
I can respect your degree, Doctor, but a man will always know his own mind best.
I nodded sheepishly. This was a poor line of questioning. Mortimer was gaining control, moving the conversation towards what he wanted rather than what would have done him some psychological good.
I knew my mind was failing me. It was becoming harder to understand the words on my notes. Each new journal published was more confusing than the last. It was awful. I'm sure you can imagine. Think if you could no longer practice the work that you'd spent your whole life doing.
Even though it was a rhetorical request, I did what he asked. Then, why your son? I wanted to get back on track, make sure we at least made some progress to sanity after our great departure.
Bah, that laggard? Art, can you believe?
He looked up at the ceiling briefly, then back at me. The muscles on his cheek were pronounced. He must have been clenching his jaw to the point of pain.
Don't get me wrong, Doctor. I love the arts. My wife loved the arts. He had a mind for the academics, though. He did well, damn it. But he had to go and throw it away. So if he wasn't going to use his brain, I figured there was nothing stopping me from doing it for him.
Had it worked, I remember him saying. It didn't work because magic isn't real, but he clearly didn't believe that. He had been leaving room in everything he said for the potential of success. Mortimer needed to account for his failure in a way that fit his own psychosis. This faulty account, I hoped, could form the spear from which we would break through his fantasy. A good line of questions after all, but there was something stopping you, wasn't there, Dr. Crove? Sympathy painted my voice, just shy of condescending pity. But it was legitimate sympathy. I owed it to this man to get him out of this. At the very least, I owed it to myself to listen and try and understand him. The light flickered.
Good, wait. You're following.
Not what I had expected. No depression of failure colored his voice. He was a frustrated academic on the verge of a breakthrough. Mortimer continued.
Now, from what I translated in the tablets, the spell binds on itself. It starts with mimicry, then control, and finally, transference. But the magic can only do so much. It can't say, put me into a dog or a mouse. The physical brain isn't similar enough. I figured my son and I would be close enough to switch, and I could count on the ravings afterward as a budding senility of an old man.
This was, again, far from my expectations. Something frivolous or obviously ridiculous, sure. Nazis took over my brain, or the neighbor's dog spoke to me. Jesus showed up and told me to, was one of the most common. Maybe something even more complex from the mind of an academic. But this? It was defensible, almost concrete, not something from a psych patient.
But the damnable thing,
he continued, clenching his fists in the air in mock rage,
that the spell must require a similarity in more than just species or brain size and development. When I sat my son down amongst the hidden symbols the spell required, and he talked long enough for me to gain control, everything was going fine. He was sobbing a bit, the milksop. But it was nothing I couldn't handle. During the transfer, though, the connection broke. The bits of ourselves were thrust back into our own heads. He was dazed, and I reacted. Well, let's leave it at violently.
The quick exhale out of both of our noses could have only been a laugh. I forced my slight smile back to neutral. taking more effort than it ought to have. I looked intently at my notes, focused myself at writing.
I knew what I needed as soon as I came to, but by then, it was far too late for another attempt, so I waited. I waited 2.5 years, Dr. Waite, for the opportunity to try this again.
My hand slowed down. I had to take a moment to process what he had just said. This? No. I had to stop this pursuit into insanity. He had brought me back to reality. Given his history of coherence and his willingness to listen to empirical evidence, I was sure it would be a simple task. I met his eyes, making sure to express my seriousness and the gravity of his mental state. Mortimer, Dr. Crove, you're an intelligent man. You must know somewhere that magic doesn't exist. What you have created is a fantasy. It's a means of coping with what had happened to your son. Things like this spell can never happen. I broke away from his face and began writing in my notes the intricate details of how I was going to rehabilitate my patient after this considerable setback.
Doctor, it's been happening since you sat down.
I stopped writing. The pen continued to move only if from the shaking of my hands. My gaze moved up. I saw Mortimer. He did not look upset or angry, what I had seen from others whose fantasies had been shattered. His face was curious, anticipating, like a child who had stumbled across a rotting carcass of a fox on the roadside. The sickening visage he wore was cast ever more terrible by the light overhead. I stood abruptly. The metal legs of the chair scraped along the tile floor before catching on a line of black grout and tipping over. I felt queasy. Well, Dr. Mortimer, I think it has been a productive session today. The words sputtered out of me from a dusty first-year psychology textbook, tucked into my brain. I'll see you again soon. I had stopped looking at him, saving myself from his cursed smile, his horrid eyes. My knuckles were clenched white, poised to knock on the door to signal the orderly to open it. But then Mortimer spoke.
No.
It was short, not drawn out the way you would speak to an infant or the curt hiss of a master to his dog. Just the word in its purest, and my hand stopped. The light flickered, and then it too stopped. The very world may have stopped. My clenched fist relaxed, the arm dropping to my side. This was not what I had told it to do.
Turn around, Dr. Waite.
I willed my feet to stay planted. They did not. I willed myself to pound on the door, but my arm stayed limp. I begged my eyes not to gaze upon his countenance, but there he was before me, standing, calm and poised, hands intertwined at his waist.
Now sit, Doctor,
he said to me.
Honestly, do you think I would let you leave after all this?
I could not tell for the life of me whether I had grabbed the chair or turned it upright because he had told me to or because I feared the feeling of not being in control of my body once more. Scratched into the metal of the chair, under the palm where I had grabbed it, were small, faint symbols, like those seen in his house the day he had murdered his son. There were no tools here for him to perform such a feat. I sat in the chair.
Akkadian, Doctor. I just finished the necessary inscriptions today. Scratching metal with your own pulled tooth is a nightmarishly long endeavor.
I didn't move. Or rather, I tried desperately to move. I just couldn't.
You see, Doctor, you and I, we're similar people. Sure, our areas of study are different, but we live in much the same academic headspace. I'd even call us friends. Isn't that wonderful? To make friends in such a wicked place. Surrounded by such wicked people.
He was giddy, manic, his arms increasingly animated as he spoke. But he had just enough control over his speech patterns and facial expressions that a layman wouldn't have noticed it as anything beyond an eccentricity.
That's why, despite what it may seem, it gives me no pleasure to do this.
Mortimer stopped mid-gesture when he said this. A grin spread like rancid butter across his face as he corrected himself.
Actually, it gives me great pleasure to do this. Just not to you in particular. Do what?
It was an effort to speak now, although that may have been because I dreaded the answer. Perhaps because somewhere, in the part of me that I had been shoving away, I knew the answer.
Tisk, tisk, Doctor. I expected better of you.
His condescension was clearly mocking. He paused for a moment, looked at me expectantly, but my expression didn't change from fear.
Not even a guess? No? Well, my mistake then.
He came close to me and put a hand on my temple, with his thumb pressing the center of my forehead. His nails dug into my skin, and I felt as though they were going to go through me. The light began popping and strobing, making the feeling even more sickening.
The spell, Doctor. It's disconcerting from the get-go, for both parties. Plus, the retaliatory response of the brain to a new consciousness is likely to be significant, if my failure is anything to draw conclusions from, at least.
Mortimer took his hand off of me and sat back down on his cot. The spots where his fingers had pushed into me pulsed with my own rapid heartbeat. He began to speak in a language I didn't understand. Something pierced my forehead. It wasn't there, but I could feel it. It was nearly indescribable, akin to a spike made out of sound and bright light pushing through my frontal bone and twisting around amongst my gray matter. He was doing this, looking for something. I opened my eyes. Long closed the pain. Mortimer sat across from me, still speaking, his entire face tightened. Brow, jaw, lips, and neck strained. He didn't make eye contact. He was looking past me, perhaps through me. The pain at my forehead expanded, pushed further into me. Whatever resistance I had was failing. I tried to take a breath, but the moment I stopped clenching my entire body, a flood of force washed the inside of my skull. The corner of Mortimer's mouth twitched upward in a frame of flickering light as I fell back in my chair and lost consciousness. When I came to, it was dark. I had no idea what time had passed, but I felt atrophied, weak. The light of the ceiling had stopped its strobing, and now was just off. I sat upright and straightened myself. A figure I thought I recognized was in the room with me. He was largely in silhouette, but I saw the sharp contours of a shirt collar and the long drapery of a lab coat. Another doctor, maybe?
You know, I never thought about it, he said, exclaiming with his hands. His voice was so close to familiar. How different you would look from in here. God, you even sound different.
The man put his hand on his chin, then pulled it away abruptly, shocked at something about it. I tried to speak, but it was difficult to move my mouth, and even harder to make noises that resembled words. All that came out was a short moan.
No, Doctor.
The voice put a hand on my shoulder.
Don't strain yourself, really.
He took a step to the end of the cot and lifted it. I felt the thin mattress shift under me. He grabbed a small book, Crove's research notes.
I can't be leaving these behind now, can I?
And he put them with the case file. I knew this voice. The man in the room knocked on the door. The faint sound of metal against metal rang as the door unlocked and came ajar. It cast the only light in the small room, a thin rectangle of warmth that failed to bounce off the dingy tile or the scratched metal chair. It illuminated only the face on my counterpart. It was a face I found difficulty in. I found a sadness and pain and anger. But I knew I had seen it.
All done, Dr. Wheat?
The gruff orderly confirmed with me. I was trying desperately to say yes, to go the hell out of this room. Then the man spoke.
Yes, thank you.
I shattered when I heard that voice again. I shattered and every piece of me weighed 100 tons. I knew the voice. My voice.
There's been a setback. Crove will have to be moved back to the high security ward. If you would grab another orderly and take care of it, then you can go home.
My voice was rushed, not quite the same, a different emphasis or drawl. He stepped my body out of the door, but poked his head back in.
Good night, Dr. Crove.
And he took his head out. The door closed, and all went dark.